Welcome back to the garage, everyone. Thanks for joining me again. So now I'm going to continue the clutch process. Now we're going to spend this video putting everything back together. But first, since we have all the old components off the clutch, pressure plate, flywheel, I wanted to compare it to the new items and see really how much of a weight difference there is. Obviously, the aluminum flywheel is going to weigh less than the stock dual mass flywheel, but I am curious to see if the pressure plate or the clutch disc are any heavier or lighter than stock. All right, so here's all the weight differences. So obviously the flywheel is the biggest difference. The aluminum is literally half. The South Bend clutch disc is a little bit heavier. I suppose that's because it's both brand new and it's a little bit more heavy duty. The pressure plate is about 3 pounds less, but because the disc is a little bit heavier, these pretty much cancel themselves out. So basically saving 15 pounds, and that is courtesy of the aluminum flywheel. So that's a good amount of weight to be saving. That'll help with some quicker revs and better acceleration. So I'm really excited to try that out and see how the car acts differently. All right, so enough playing around. We're gonna get back under this car and get everything back together. All right, now we're back under here. We can install our new pilot bushing here, nice and new. You can put a thin coat of grease on here just to make it slide in better, and then actually use your alignment tool, and you can gently tap that into the crank here. You don't want to use anything solid because this is a very soft metal, and it will bend, and yes, I speak from experience. All right, so now that the pilot bushing's installed, I'm going to install the new flywheel. This is the contact surface that faces outward. This is where the clutch comes in contact. These are the teeth for the starter, and then these are the markings for the crankshaft position sensor. So you have to make sure, it really can only go on one way, especially because there's the hole for the dowel pin on the crank, and it even says rear. Focus, there you go, rear. So we can install that now and make sure to apply some, I use blue Loctite on the bolts, and then those get torqued to 65 foot-pounds. First do them hand tight, and then torque them to 65 foot-pounds, and do it in a star pattern so they make sure the flywheel goes on even. Alright, so we have our fresh flywheel on here. This is the surface that comes in contact with the clutch disc. So before I put the clutch disc and the pressure plate on, I like to wipe this down with some brake cleaner, make sure there's no oil or anything on there. And these are all torqued down, so just a word of advice, this flywheel, the crank is going to want to spin when you tighten these. So you have to jam it somehow. I use a screwdriver in one of the starter teeth. That's not the professional preferred method to do it, but it works. We're going to be installing the clutch disc and pressure plate now. This is labeled, this is the transmission side, so the thicker side goes towards the pressure plate and the thin goes against the flywheel. Don't really want to touch the material here, get any oil or grease on there. So what you're going to do is you're going to take your alignment tool and stick it in the crank where your pilot bushing is. Then your clutch disc will basically sit on there, on the splines there, and just make sure your disc is centered on the flywheel and then on the pressure plate. And similar to the pressure plate contact area, I like to spray that down again with brake clean, make sure there's no grease, oil on there. And then once you install it, there's holes for little dowel pins that are on the flywheel. Again, it can only go really one way, so you may have to rotate a little bit till those holes match up. So I'm going to get back under again, install the clutch disc and the pressure plate, and when you install the bolts, the factory service manual suggests to do 11 foot-pounds all the way around first, just to get the pressure plate seated, and then crank up the torque wrench to 29 foot-pounds and work your way around again in the star-shaped pattern to make sure that everything goes on evenly. So last thing we have to do before we throw the transmission back up is install the new Z-Speed slave cylinder, and it gets tightened up with two 10mm bolts. It gets tightened up as a 10mm Allen key, so just throw some blue Loctite on there, tighten them down. The one's already in there since this piece kind of blocks it, so that's in there. The second one's included in the box. So now we can go ahead and put this on. These stainless steel lines get routed through the dust boot, and then once this is on, then the transmission can go back. important to make sure that the clutch lines are fed nicely through this dust boot here. A little bit of wrestling and it'll come through, and then you can attach, this is the bleeder valve. This attaches back to the factory point, and then you'll just let this other line hang. We'll deal with that once we get the transmission back in. So now that all the new components are in, the clutch, flywheel, slave cylinder, now it's time to jack the transmission back up and do everything in reverse order and finally get this thing done. Before you throw the transmission back up there, just throw a light coating of grease on the input shaft of the transmission, the little splines there, just to make it easier to go back on. I also dab a little bit of grease on the dowel pins that are on the sides of the casing, just because those get hung up sometimes, so it'll make it easier to get back mated to the engine. And then just to note, when you jack it up there and you're trying to wiggle it back on, it is going to take a little bit of wrestling, just kind of wiggle it back and forth until it finds its position and it'll pop right on. And then we can get back to tightening all the bolts up and getting this thing back on the ground. Alright, so there's a transmission attached back to the engine. I have one bolt on either side of the transmission, 17 millimeter, kind of like I had before I removed it. And I put these 4 smaller bolts in kind of finger tight, just so that the transmission has some room to slide forward if need be when I put the rest of the bolts in the bell housing. And then once that's done, I can snug these up the rest of the way. Alright, so now we can throw the rest of the bolts into the bell housing. The longer, the 17 millimeter bolts get torqued down to 55 foot-pounds, and the shorter 14 millimeter bolts get torqued down to 34 foot-pounds. And just remember, 2 of the smaller bolts, the 14 millimeter bolts, are used to hold in the starter. Make sure you get that aligned before you throw those bolts in. Also, the one top 17 millimeter bolt, the top one that's kind of on the closer to the passenger side, that holds the little bracket with the breather hose. So make sure to throw that back on when you tighten that bolt and hook up the breather hose back to the transmission. Since this part is pretty self-explanatory for putting the bolts back in, I'm going to time-lapse this portion of the video, and then we will touch base before I hook up all the electronics back onto the transmission. Alright, so just a little update. I replaced the front suspension cover there. I reran all the wiring. The wiring kind of just, follows its original path, so just make sure it kind of gets tucked up nice back up there, and then where it attaches to its brackets, just make sure those are all nice and snug. To reattach the clip to the switch up here, I found it was easiest if I loosen these bolts and let the back drop a little bit so I can get my hand up there and clip that back in. Also, make sure you don't forget to reinstall your crankshaft position sensor up top there and plug that in. So really all I have left to do now is reinstall the shifter, and I'll show you how to do that and realign the shift plate, the drive shaft, install that, the couple heat shields I have down here which go on after the drive shaft, and then I think that should be it. Then the moment of truth of starting it up, making sure everything is good. Oh, and I also have to install the stainless steel clutch line. I forgot to do that, so I got to do that as well. And then hopefully once the car's on the ground and we go for a test drive, everything will be good. So next I'm going to throw the shifter back in and we'll align the shift plate. Alright, so it's shifter time to put this thing back in the car. Make sure you put your spring back in there, and there's a little groove on this bracket, and it matches up with that groove there, or whatever you like to call it. And there's only one way it can go in, and then lightly put in your shift plate with the 3 screws. Don't tighten it all the way because we do have to adjust that, which I'll show you. Yeah, so let's get that in, and you also have to attach it on the bottom to the actual bracket before you adjust the shift point. Alright, so the shifter's back in, it's hooked up underneath the car. So now, like I was mentioning, you have to align this shift plate here, this triangular bracket. I really apologize, it's really hard to see. I couldn't get the shift knob off, so I gotta keep all this crap on here. Anyway, then what you want to do is you want to put the car into 5th gear. And then once it's in 5th gear, you want to push that plate right against the notch on the shifter so it's touching. And then you can kind of tighten these bolts a little bit more so it stays. And then once you do that, then you put it into 6th gear. And then you do the same thing with 6th gear. You make sure it's lined up back there. Pretty much allows the shifter to glide into 5th and 6th. So once that's tightened down and all aligned, you want to be able to go from 4th right to 5th without any hang up. If that plate is too far this way, you'll get caught in a little notch. And then again, you want to be able to go right smoothly to 6th. And if you're able to do all that smoothly, then you got your shifter plate aligned properly. All right, so everything's back together with this shifter. Don't forget to plug in your little bracket, or your, what do you call it, the connector, like into the bracket. Can't talk today. Pop this back up in here, the little clip, and then when you put your trim piece back on, don't forget to plug it back in. And this just goes down like that. This pops back in and you're all set. All right, shifter's in, time to do the drive shaft. Alright, so we got the drive shaft on and tightened up, and then this center bracket here too. I forget the exact torque numbers, but I will put them probably like right here once I look it up. So like I said, this is all tight, ready to go. And that's got to put back some of those heat shields. They go around here, so just put those back on. And I got that little bracket to put on as well. And we can turn our tension back up here. I got to do the new clutch line, the stainless steel line, and then of course reinstall the exhaust. Alright, so I got the lines all hooked up. The second line that comes out of the transmission, you route it around here, reinstall one of those bolts to hold the bracket, and that clips back onto the clutch line. I installed the stainless steel insulated clutch line. The bracket up there is kind of a pain in the butt. It's going to take some time to get a wrench up there, wiggle it free. You're just working in some tight areas, so just take your time. And there is a clip just like this up there that takes some finesse to get it off, and then just do reverse order, put it back together, and then make sure these clips are in, all your unions are tight, but don't over tighten them, but just make sure they're nice and snug up there as well. And then make sure your bleeder is tight for now. So now we're on the home stretch. Just have to install the exhaust, fill the trans with fluid, and then we can fill with clutch fluid as well and bleed the system. So shouldn't be too much longer, and we're finally getting there. So now we're going to take our brake fluid, fill up our clutch master cylinder. Remember I told you to leave the bleeder screw closed? So we're going to fill up the master cylinder. Then we're going to go underneath and break the bleeder screw loose slightly. And for, I would say, between 5 and 10 minutes, you're going to let the system gravity bleed. So just let it drip out very slowly. Put a pan under there to catch it. But you have to pay attention to the brake, or the clutch master cylinder rather, because it's relatively small, so it doesn't hold too much. And the last thing you want to do when you're bleeding this system is, drain the fluid like that, and then have to start all over again. And just like that, it'll start to drip. So you're going to want to do that, like I said, about 5-10 minutes, and just keep an eye on that reservoir so it doesn't go dry. Alright, so I let the system self-bleed for about 5 minutes or so. I ran through about the equivalent of about 3 reservoirs full of fluid through the system. So I just went under, tightened up the bleeder so it stopped draining. I checked all the connections, all the unions, and make sure they weren't leaking anywhere, so everything looks good. So now what you got to do is pretty much you go in the car and pump the pedal about 5 times till the system is pressurized. Then you go back under the car and do a quick open close of the bleeder, and this will get any of the remaining air out of the system. These systems are kind of a pain in the butt to bleed, so you may have to do that back and forth a few times. Like I said, pump the pedal about 5 times, go under, open close on the bleeder. It really helps at this point if you do have an extra set of hands. Someone can be in the car while you're under it, and you can do this a little quicker. So we're gonna go ahead and pump the pedal about 5 times. It's normal to have to pull the pedal back up for the first few strokes until it gains pressure back. Alright, so it looks like the clutch system is fully bled. It's going to take you a little while. You may be good for a couple rounds, and then you'll see air come through. So just do it, 5, 6, 7 times just to make sure that you get all the air out of there. Otherwise, you'll have a funky pedal feel, and the engagement will be affected and all that stuff. So I guess there's nothing left to do except hooking up the battery and starting it up and making sure everything is working properly. Well, it looks like I can take a little sigh of relief here. Looks like everything is working. I mean, at least, it's still in the air, but I ran through all the gears, slowly, of course, but ran through all the gears, and it does seem okay. No hang-ups or noises or anything like that. All right, so it looks like that concludes the install of the new clutch flywheel and slave cylinder. I hope this, 2-part video helped you if this is a project that you're considering doing. I wouldn't recommend this for a beginner, but if you have, a decent amount of knowledge and some tools, it's really not something that you can't tackle yourself. I mean, clearly, like I said, I did it on jack stands. So, like I said, I hope this video helped you, or I hope these videos helped you. If they did, please give a big thumbs up. Really appreciate it. If you have any questions about this, I tried to document everything I could, but with being under the car and having limited space, there are some things that I couldn't really film, or if I did, you really wouldn't be seeing much. So I do hope that I covered most of everything, but in any event, if you have any questions, drop them down below. Be sure to answer them. So thanks to everyone for their continued support. I really appreciate it, and also thanks for bearing with me during the busy time with my move and relocation. I also appreciate that. So I hope you enjoyed the videos, like I said. I hope it was somewhat helpful to you, and I guess I will see you next time for the next project. Have a great day, and I will see you next time.